Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, here with an in-depth wiring and setup guide on the Lian Li Edge Gold. In this video I'm going to talk to you about all the different things you need to know for setting up the Edge Gold in your system, the wiring and connectivity of this power supply unit, and all the things that you need to know to connect all the different wires and cables that you can see in your system and what they'd be used for, so you can work out how it works and how to set it up. Naturally, I'm also going to cover the USB and fan hub later on in the video, and I'll leave timestamps down below so that you can jump to the relevant points and see these things in more depth if you need to leap backwards and forwards. As you can see, this is a detachable USB and fan hub, which makes life a lot easier in your build depending on what you're putting in. So I want to talk about how that works, what you can connect to it, and the things you need to know about it later on. But first I'm going to start with the initial logic of the build. I'm going to lay all this out on a desk so it's really clear for you to see and go through these steps. We'll also show you wiring it directly into the system later on in the video as well. Now, I'd recommend removing the fan hub to start with. Don't put that in place just yet because it's easier to plug all the cables in beforehand and at least to see things. So we're going to start with the motherboard connectivity and the 24-pin power cable. This is this large one here that you can see on one end is split into two parts, on the other end connects to the motherboard. You'll notice there are cable combs on here as well, which will become important in a minute. And this connectivity basically plugs into this part that's marked M/B 18 plus 10P on this part of the power supply on the edge here. And you need to make sure you plug in both parts of that connector, obviously, and to make sure that they're fully seated and pushed all the way in. You'll see there's a little clip on the side there that needs to be pushed in. You should hear it click into place and feel it connect up as well. So this is the power cable that plugs into the right hand side of the motherboard. So you can see a Maximus Hero Z890 here as a demonstration of what's what. And on this board there's actually two connectors, the 24-pin power connector and then a PCIe power connector just below that. Now generally you won't have a PCIe power connector on most motherboards, so you just be looking for that 24-pin power cable on the right hand side. But just in case you have a similar board, I'll show you the PCIe power in a second as well. So with the 24-pin power connector, it turns around and plugs in on the right-hand side there, and you'll see there's a little clip that hooks over that. So you need to make sure this is pushed all the way in and clicks into place, and you can only put it in one way round. Obviously, don't do this until you've fully installed it in your build, but I want it to be really clear where you plug the cables in and how that connects up. And so make sure you don't actually plug that in until the end, otherwise you will find it difficult to remove. Now, there's additional cable combs included in the box because you'll see that the cable itself, once you plug it in, is a little bit messy. You can try and thread your cables through here to tidy things up a bit. Now, I'll admit I found this really fiddly and awkward and frustrating and annoying. My patience levels are really low, so I ended up just abandoning it. But if you have the patience and the skill and nimble hands, then perhaps you can use this to tidy up the cables a little bit more. There is one of these included with the cable anyway, but you can use additional. I ended up just using plastic cable ties because it made it look neater, and most of that's going to be hidden at the back anyway, so it won't be a problem. Now, there's CPU and EPS power cables at the top left. Most motherboards will have two of these. I'd recommend plugging in both cables into these ports. Sometimes you'll find there's one 8-pin and one 4-pin. Sometimes just one 8-pin, sometimes two 8-pins, as I've got in this instance. You'll see the cables are marked CPU on one end and then PSU 08 on the other end. That's the part that plugs into the power supply unit, and obviously the CPU part plugs into the motherboard. So you plug them into the ports marked PCIe and CPU that you can see in the top row here. Just find a spare port and plug those into it and connect those up on one end, and then the other end will plug into the top left of the motherboard. So on this motherboard you can see them up there, little grey ones. And again, same sort of logic as the previous ports in that they have little clips on them and hooks, so you can only connect them up one way round, so you shouldn't find that you have to force it. It should click in pretty easily. Now, one of the cables you can also split that in half. So if you do have a motherboard that only requires one 8-pin and one 4-pin, and this is how you do it. You just split that in half and then you just plug half of the cable in instead of the whole thing. But this motherboard requires two 8-pins, so we make sure it's clicked together and then seat it into that port, and that's how that would plug in and connect up. Pretty easy, and as you can hear, there's a little click when you plug it in. And that's the basic wiring for the standard powering of a motherboard. You need to make sure all these cables are connected up in order to make sure it powers on. But there's this additional PCIe power cable for this motherboard, as I said. And this plugs into the CPU and PCIe ports as well. You'll see it's slightly different. It has PCIe written on one end of it and PSU 08 on the other, but it plugs into the similar ports, so the CPU and PCIe power ports up here on this row. You plug one end in there and then the other end, pinch the cables together, make sure they're knotted together in there, and then push it into the port. And you can see that from this angle, again, with those plastic clips. Now, this is fairly unusual, but it's a high-end motherboard, so it requires that additional PCIe power. This is the same cables that you'd use for your graphics card. You do have 4 of those cables included in the box, so in theory it should be fine. And you can see we have 4 cables, 3 of which are single connectors. So a single connector on one end and then a PCIe power connector on the other. And then there's a 4th one, which is this pigtail affair, which has 2 connectors on it. So you've got 4 cables, so in theory it should be fine for that motherboard and for your graphics card as well. So next we're going to get on to GPU wiring. So we've got the B580 from ASRock, the Steel Legend. Now this requires 2 PCIe power connectors on it, as you can see on the side here. It's similar sort of logic with older Nvidia cards and with AMD GPUs as well. So you probably find you have to use 2 or 3 or maybe 1 8-pin PCIe power connector. It's going to vary from graphics card to graphics card, but this one requires it, and so does the 3090. So this Gigabyte 3090 that I've got also requires 2 8-pin PCIe power connectors. So no matter what you're using with these sorts of logic, you have to plug 2 cables in. So make sure you use those individual cables, plug the PSU end into the CPU and PCIe row at the top, and then the other end will plug into the GPU. So in this instance for these GPUs, I'd use 2 cables, one plugged in there, and then the other one you can see is a little bit fiddly. You have to push the cables together, so you can see there's this little notch on the edge there that you have to sort of line up and pinch together, and then you have to push it in and make sure it's fully seated. Just be careful with this, because if that additional bit comes loose and it doesn't fully seat in, then your GPU might not get the power it needs. So you do need to make sure it's pushed all the way in, and then slide it into your graphics card, and you should find it a little bit fiddly, but it will push in there. Now, this might be easier when it's in the case, or it might not. Depends how much access you have to your build, but I like to show these things outside of the case so it's really clear and easy for you to see what you're meant to be doing. So pinching those cables together, pushing those in, make sure they're clicked all the way in, fully seated, and that'll ensure that the GPU gets maximum power and gives you the performance that you should be able to get from it. Otherwise, you might find it's underpowered and not doing the job that it should. But as you can see, those are the cables required for these 2 GPUs. You might require a 3rd one. Now, there are other things that might require PCIe power. So in this build that I'm doing, for example, I'm using Corsair's iCue Link fans. These have a controller which has an adapter that plugs in there, and that requires PCIe power. So this thing requires power because it then powers the fans and other things in the system all in one cooler and such. And so you need to have an additional spare PCIe power cable for that. So this is worth keeping in mind. Obviously, we've got 4 cables in the box, so we can use one of those cables here, and you can plug that in. You could use one of the pigtail cables for this as an alternative, so you've the option of connecting a couple of devices up there if it's not as power intensive like the GPU would be, for example. But hopefully you've got spare in your system if you need to do this. Now, obviously, the same sort of logic applies with Lian Li's fan controllers. So for the TL series fans, not the wireless ones, but the older generation, you can see those require PCIe power as well. So for the LCD fans, the TL series, you have this controller, you need PCIe power there as well. Now, you might also want a 40 series or 50 series Nvidia GPU, which uses the 12-volt high power connector instead, or the 12-volt 2x6. Lian Li's Edge Gold power supply has this 600-watt capable power cable. If you've bought the high-end 1000-watt model and upwards, there's different models available with different power cables. But this is used for something like powering 5090, which is what I've been using it for in my system. Your 40 and 50 series Nvidia GPUs generally come with this adapter included in the box, which takes multiple PCIe power cables and puts them into one single connector that plugs into the graphics card. It looks hideous, so this power connector is much better. You can use it on 40 and 50 series. I've been using it on the 4090, for example, which you can see here. That's what the connector looks like. You can see it's quite a bit different from the 8-pin PCIe power connectors. Instead, it's multiple pins. Now, it plugs in on the right-hand side of the power supply unit. Both ends are the same, so it doesn't matter which way around you do it. Plugs in, but you've got to make sure you push it all the way in so you can't see the blue pins anymore. That's important. It needs to be fully seated in so you don't have any problems with melting and other issues. Now, Lian Li says they've improved the connectors on this, so it's even better anyway, so you shouldn't see any problems with any of that. You can plug it directly into a 40 series or 50 series GPU without any worries. Now we're on to SATA connectors. So these are for things like hard disk drives, SSDs, other fan controllers. These are daisy chain cables, so you can see one end plugs into the power supply unit, then you've got multiple L-shaped connectors on it across the cable. You get 3 cables included in the box, slightly different types, as you can see. The third one is basically very close together ports, so you can see these connectors are all close together. If you've got a rack in your system with multiple SSDs in it, for example, where you can plug those in quite easily with that cable. These plug into the SATA and Molex connectors on the bottom left of the Edge power supply, and then you can plug in your SSDs into them. Note this is a L-shaped connector, so it can only plug in one way. It's got this little notch down the edge of it, so you need to make sure it's lined up properly so that you'll be able to plug it in. Good news is, though, you can use one cable to connect multiple different drives to it. You can use SSDs and hard disk drives on the same cable if you want to, or multiple SSDs, and easily power them with this cable, so it's very nice. As you can see, it's flat and thin as well, so it's really easy to route through your case and to keep tidy in the build too. So multiple connectors for this. Now, as I've mentioned, you might use them for fan controllers, so older generations of Lian Li's fan controllers require them, and SATA power is also required for other things. You'll also have these data cables that should be included with your motherboard that you plug into the other port on the SSD, and then those will plug into the motherboard to make sure the signals pass through from the drive and the motherboard back and forth. So they plug in on the right-hand side here and the bottom right, and then that's that sets up for wiring those in and getting those set up nicely. So hopefully that's helped with those. And then you have this PATA cable, which is used for other things. Generally, you don't use this very often, but it might be used for a custom loop system for a liquid pump, for example, or pump reservoir combo. You'll find that this cable is used for that. That plugs into the SATA and Molex connectors and then into your whatever thing you're using. Now let's have a look at the USB hub. So this is a really nice inclusion to the power supply unit because it gives you the option to connect up multiple devices. If you're throwing in Lian Li fans into the system, you'll often find that you need a controller for it. And then when you've got that controller, you'll need to plug in a USB connection to your motherboard. You often only have one USB connection, so this essentially allows you to plug in multiple USB connectors to this hub instead, and then power it from the power supply unit. So you'll notice it's got a clip on the top that you can just slot it in, and then it will get its power from there. And then you have another connector like this that runs from that hub to the motherboard, taking the signal for all the different things that you've got connected up to it through to the motherboard really easily. Now, this is really handy. I usually recommend purchasing an additional powered hub from NZXT or Corsair to solve this problem. So if you've got an all-in-one cooler and multiple fans and other things that require USB connections, this can be a good solution. Plug your USB cable from the motherboard signal port to the motherboard itself. Obviously, that sends the signal for anything that's connected from this hub into it. You need to make sure it's connected up to the power supply so that it gets powered, because if you plug in multiple devices, you'll find that they won't get the signal through to the motherboard without it. USB connections can only plug in one way because they're missing a pin on them, so it's easy to work out where that goes, and then you can connect it up. Now, it's worth noting there are some caveats to this. If you're using LCD fans, like the TL LCD, you can't use port 1, which is the one closest to the motherboard signal, so don't use that first port. If you try and plug that into that first port, it'll be a problem. So use 2, 3, and 4, which are the ones further away from the white port. The manual specifically says this, so just watch out if you do that. You might have problems where these devices just don't work properly if they're plugged into that first port. So it's worth bearing in mind and something to think about. Now, this hub can be mounted to your case. So it will magnetically mount to your case if you've got space. And then instead of plugging it into the power supply unit, you can get it further away, but you will require a PCIe power cable for this. So the PCIe power cable plugs in, obviously, the CPU and PCIe power connectors, and then will plug into the USB and fan hub. Obviously, it needs powering, especially if you're using USB connections, but also if you're going to be plugging fans into it, You need to pinch it together like you would for your graphics card, and then pop that in. Now you don't need to plug this cable in if the hub is slotted onto the power supply. Don't do that, because then it's getting power from both ends of it and it would break. It'll be bad. But if you want to put it further away in your case, somewhere in a useful position where you can plug in other cables, then you can do it. So you have choices here, which is pretty nice. Got a lot of flexibility in how to use it and where you're going to connect it up. Although you do obviously end up then using an additional PCIe power cable, which isn't ideal. But you could plug 4 USB devices into it and then USB signal from the motherboard to the device and back and forth. So it makes life a lot easier and is really handy. Now you can actually do more with it than just 4 as well. You can use splitters. So these additional things that I happen to have, additional purchases, they're not included with the power supply unit. But you can see we've got a USB splitter, which is 2 connectors on one end and 1 connection on the other. You can plug that into every port apart from the first one. So again, don't use that first port. That means that you can have up to 7 USB devices theoretically connected to this hub. So you can use splitters on 3 of the ports, and then you can have multiple splitters basically and multiple USB devices. Now you probably won't have this many, but if for some reason you do, then you can do that. And you can connect up a mass of USB things and really make your life easier. As well as being handy for connecting up USB devices, the hub is also useful for connecting fan power. So it has multiple different fan power connectors on it, 4-pin connectors for connecting up your Unifans or other fans to it. It has the same sort of logic. You plug the cable from the fans into it, and then you plug a motherboard signal cable into a PWM header so that your motherboard can see it and can control the speed. But essentially this is basically a splitter that allows you to plug in multiple fans with ease. And this logically works quite well with Lian Li's wireless fans. So you're going to see me plugging in the wireless fans to it, because these new wireless fans have a PWM cable that plugs into them. And you can also use them with the LCD versions of the wireless fans. So plug the fan power cable in one side and the USB connection in the other. Just remembering not to plug the USB connector into the first port, the one nearest the signal port. Otherwise you won't have a problem with that, because of the LCD screen on it won't work properly. So something to bear in mind there. But this means that you can keep those cables off the motherboard and keep things nice and neat, because with those fans, if you've seen my wiring guide on those fans, you have to plug these connectors into the motherboard generally. But now you can plug them all into the hub, keep them at the back of your system, keep things nice and neat and tidy as well. And then you have the signal cable. So this is the other cable which plugs from the hub into the motherboard, and it basically allows the signal to be detected so that you can control the fan speed from there. But you do need to make sure that's connected up to the motherboard, and then in the BIOS you set it to PWM mode so that you can do that. But basically this is powering all of those fans off one port and using the hub power obviously to do that. So it just makes things a lot neater. Now for installing the Edge power supply, if you've got a dual chamber case like this, slot it in so that the fan's facing outwards so that it can pull air from the outside, and then use the 4 screws to secure it to the case at the rear. We'll then need to run the cabling through the channels in the case. So this is to have an HS420V GPU. Run the cables through there. Obviously the 2 8-pin CPU power connectors up here plugging into the left hand side, as I showed you earlier on in the video. And then the 24-pin power cable, which is going to require some cable management at the rear. As you can see, it's quite thick and large, so you will need to tie it down and maybe use plastic cable ties to sort it out. Run that through and plug that in on the right hand side as I've shown. And so I wanted to be able to show you how to do this now, but you can see the difference is not as easy to see when it's inside the build. And if you've got a smaller case, it might be even more difficult. But you can adjust the cable combs at this point as well to neaten things up. Then the PCIe power connector just below that, slot that into place. Again, make sure they're pushed all the way in so they all click into place. It's especially important with a 24-pin power cable. Then I'm slotting the 5090 into place in this vertical GPU mount, and then I'm going to plug that cable into there. So this is a bit tricky to see from this angle, but again, watch out for those blue parts of the pins. You need to make sure you can't see them when it's pushed in. That'll show you that it's pushed all the way in. So you just slot it in and push it all the way in. You shouldn't be able to see those blue connectors anymore, and that'll ensure that it's definitely fully seated in there. I'd also recommend making sure that the cables aren't interfering with each other. There's not too much tension on that power cable, because it might get problematic otherwise. Now, I've shown the iCue Link connectors and what I needed to do here, but I wanted to just quickly talk about this because I was using the 12 volt 2x6 power connector for the 5090, which then frees up the PCIe power connectors. I had to use 2 Corsair iCue Link connectors in this system, which meant I had to use 2 over 8-pin PCIe power connectors for that, and also 1 for the motherboard. So you can see I got very close to using up all the power connectors, but it did end up working out in the end, and this is the finished build. Hopefully this has been a helpful video for you. I realise it's been quite long, but in-depth and probably detailed everything you need to, hopefully. So let me know in the comments if it was useful. Thanks very much for watching, and if you're curious, subscribe to see the full review of this Haven build and of the 5090. Thanks very much for watching.